Father Lopez, thank you for kind introduction. I am very grateful for this very prestigious invitation. Thank you to the Dean David Crawford. Meredith Rice has been very helpful in arranging my visit here. It's an advantage and disadvantage to open the conference with outstanding speakers tomorrow. It's advantage because I will be the first one to talk about certain issues. Disadvantage because I will be corrected tomorrow, and I will not have opportunity perhaps to respond and to have time to show my side of the problem. Thank you for being here. I am always supported and strengthened by the presence of my brother Dominicans here. Thank you. Let me start with a short story from the past. In July 1992, I came to Washington to study at the Institute when Professor Carl Anderson was the dean at the Institute. So when I settled at the Dominican House of Studies across the street, I had the meeting one of the first meetings with my dean, and he said, he asked, so what would you like to write about while you're in the Institute? And I said, you know, in Eastern Europe, we have this experience that everything that you have here in the United States comes to Eastern Europe after about 20 years. So if I look carefully at your social problems, I will be a prophet in my own country when I return. And possibly I may also know some solutions, you know, so I will be a very valuable scholar then. And therefore, I said I would like to study something about Catholic social thought and new problems with the public order in the United States. And he looked at me and he said, good. You are Polish, you are priest, you are Dominican, you should be writing about Karol Wojtyła. And I said, good. So that's really one of the conversations that influences the course of our lives. That's the way the superiors can really move our life in a certain direction, and I am very grateful that you did. It brought me to the place where I am now. The title of my lecture is Karol Wojtyła, Unveiling of the Human Person, the Integration of Metaphysics and Phenomenology. In conversation with his lifelong friend, Mieczysław Maliński, John Paul II said once that in his life he had two great philosophical revelations, Thomism and Phenomenology. He said, Thomas gave me answer to many problems, and Scheller taught me a lot about personality and methods of investigation. So those two philosophical revelations created in the very unique endeavor of Karol Wojtyła what I would call a phenomenological ontology of the human person. Phenomenological ontology of the human person. Ontology, as it has been already said today, crucial for Christocentric anthropology of Vatican II, crucial for Christian ethics as presented in the papal magisterium, especially in Veritatis Splendor, but crucial also for our debate with Novus Ordo Secularum, with the modern liberalism, crucial for Catholic social thought, but also ecclesiology and the whole of theology, which revolves around the concept of person, after all. We know that this double philosophical revelation happened relatively early in the intellectual life of Karol Wojtyła. He was fortunate, unlike a lot of his contemporaries in the 20th century, to develop in his mature thinking these early inspirations. So there was no, when we follow chronologically the intellectual life of Karol Wojtyła, we realize that unlike many other intellectuals in the 20th century, there was no intellectual revolution that would reverse the earlier stage. It's very amazing. Therefore, when we read the early articles of Karol Wojtyła from 1950s and 1960s, that we will be getting thanks to the English translation, we realize that they really are in nucleo, like something that already projects his mature thinking. One of his early articles, Mystery and Man, from 1951. He was 31 years old, but this is almost like an encyclical. A moving witness of an early so this is a methodological presupposition on which I will rest, and my scholarship of Karol Wojtyła really rests. Development, very early maturity that consisted in seeing very clearly some fundamental principles of the reality and developing, building on them. A moving witness to an early encounter with Thomistic metaphysics one can find in John Paul II conversation with André Frossard, where the newly elected Pope talks about his seminary formation in the early 1940s in Nazi-occupied Poland. Unfortunately, he had to learn metaphysics from a rather bad neo-scholastic manual. It's called Ontology, written by Kazimierz Weiss, professor at the University of Lwów. He recalls this time 40 years later. I very much like this quote. I quote it often for the reason that I will explain. So he said, "Straight away I found myself up against my obstacle. My literary training centered around humanities had not prepared me at all for the scholastic theses and formulas with which the manual was filled. I had to cut a path through a thick undergrowth of concepts, analysis, and axioms without even being able to identify the ground over which I was moving. After 2 months of hacking through this vegetation, I came to a clearing, to the discovery of the deep reasons for what until then I had only lived and felt. When I passed the examination, I told the examiner that in my view the new vision of the world, which I had acquired in my struggle with that metaphysical manual, was more valuable than the mark which I had obtained. I was not exaggerating. What intuition and sensibility until then taught me about the world found solid confirmation." The end of quotation. I like this text at least for 3 reasons. First, it's certainly a consolation and encouragement for students, especially studying poorly written books, and poorly written manuals. Wojtyła was studying the manual for 2 months, trying to understand it. Many students would already throw the book out the window. And as a matter of fact, the whole generations of students in post-war Krakow learn metaphysics from exactly the same book. Some very famous Polish phenomenologists. So if sometimes we need to get to the reason why people dislike Thomas or dislike metaphysics, we don't have to get into very serious investigation. We just have to look at the manuals from which they learned Aquinas. But secondly, more importantly, Wojtyła's hard work is rewarding, as he says, what intuition and sensibility taught me until then found solid confirmation. Young seminarian came to a clearing. It's interesting that John Paul II uses here, of course, term from the Martin Heidegger's Phenomenology, Lichtung, ein clearing. Discovery of the deep reasons for what until then I had only lived and felt. One can say that Wojtyła discovers in classical metaphysics a hidden, invisible structure of the world. What he presumed to exist, he sensed its frames in his poetic sensibility and imagination, but now he has intellectual frame for it. He has the intellectual structure, he has the concepts elaborated by the tradition. This hidden structure provides a conceptual unity to our world. Therefore, metaphysics has been always so precious for theological account of creation. In theology, it is namely the theology of creation that ultimately explains the unity of everything. That's why metaphysics is so important for theology. Thirdly, it is important to remember that when Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, refers to metaphysics, it's usually the metaphysics in its Aristotelian Thomistic form with its crucial distinctions. Essence, existence, matter, form, substance, accidents, potency, act, and with some of the crucial theories that make it intelligible. For example, the theory of four causes. We will see later how Wojtyła uses this classical metaphysics in anthropology. All early anthropological writings of Karol Wojtyła from 1940s and 1950s really mirror the Aristotelian Thomistic account of the human person. Reflections about the essence of man from 1951, on the cognition of God and others. So Wojtyła starts really from very solid knowledge about metaphysical concept of the human person. I will later elaborate of what it exactly means. The second philosophical revelation of young Karol Wojtyła consisted in his encounter with phenomenology of Max Scheler. We know well the reasons why Wojtyła was asked to read Scheler, but by one of his theological mentors in Krakow, Professor Ignacy Różycki. Phenomenology was warmly welcomed in the late 19th and early 20th century in Western Catholic intellectual circles, mostly for two reasons. First, because of its criticism of Immanuel Kant's epistemology and his destruction of natural theology. Secondly, because of Edmund Husserl's promise of going back to existing things, zurück zu den Sachen selbst, which confirmed the realistic conviction of the Catholic tradition that we can know the existent. The goal of Wojtyła's encounter with Max Scheler philosophy was to examine whether it can serve the New Testament ethics in the way as Aristotle, metaphysics, served theology of Thomas Aquinas, or some modern theologians tried to use Martin Heidegger's philosophy in interpretation of Christian thought. The final conclusion, as it was already said today, of Wojtyła in his habilitation thesis is negative. Scheller's ethics cannot be used as a means to interpret Christian ethics. Wojtyła points out that one of the weakest points in Scheler ethics, which basically undermines his entire theory, is his concept of person. Because of his phenomenological method, Scheler describes the person not as a substance, but as a unity of feelings and different experiences. According to Scheler, the phenomenological principles do not allow one to analyze a person as an efficient cause, but only as a unity of acts. Therefore, Wojtyła writes, therefore a person does not realize anything, but only feels the values which flow through in different directions. Neither the acts nor the values, however, originate in the person as in an efficient cause. At this point, Scheller's phenomenology loses the whole dynamics of the human person, who is for him only a passive subject of feeling, but not an active cause of one's own actions. The end of quotations of Wojtyła from Lublin lectures. Wojtyła's criticism of Scheller's anthropology is not far from what Alistair MacIntyre has pointed out in his renowned After Virtue as emotivism of modern ethics, a certain anti-metaphysical shallowness of analysis, an impossibility to look deeper. This shallowness will be redeemed by Wojtyła with the help of Thomistic metaphysics, also with his emphasis on the body, on the importance of the body. Scheller by no means has been extremely important partner in polemics for early Karol Wojtyła that influenced his development in many areas of his thought, in his view of conscience, in his understanding of the human body, of human emotions, in his understanding that a Catholic intellectual needs ontology of the human person. The experience is not enough. When I was writing my doctorate dissertation on basically something similar, I had a chapter on Scheller. And there was a very kind lady working at the library of the Dominican House of Studies, wonderful Laura Ingram. And she wanted to help me with my English, to translate my English into American English. So I was giving her my notes, and she would translate it into the proper English. So when I gave her my chapter on Scheller, and she was working at the Dominican Library, but at the same time she was teaching at one of the high schools nearby in the area. So when I gave her my chapter on Scheller, after a couple of days she called me that the Scheller is ready. I stopped by the library, and she comes to me waving this paper on Scheller, everything in red. And she said, this is wonderful, this is wonderful. And I said, Laura, what's wonderful about Max Scheller? And she said, listen, this man, Max Scheller, he explained exactly how my kids in high school are thinking. You know? So, of course, we know that this is a mark of every great intellectual, to be able to foresee how people will behave 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And this is the case with Max Scheller and with his emotivism and with his concentration, or how do you feel, what do you feel, you know, what you feel about things, and so on. Wojtyła got it right in his criticism of Scheller. However, despite his criticism of Scheller, Wojtyła gained from reading main work of German phenomenologist something that will stay with him till the end of his life, and what make his later writings so distinct, the phenomenological method. Wojtyła underlines in his habilitation thesis from 1953 that Scheller ethics can be helpful in an analysis of moral values and ethical choices, because it can help to describe ethical facts in their phenomenal and experiential dimension. Ethical facts form objects of the person's internal experience. Therefore, in order to describe them, one needs a method able to study human experience, to describe human experience. The method of psychology, he writes, is not able to fulfill this task because ex principio it puts aside what's important, the normative and axiological phenomena of personal experience. Wojtyła is aware that Scheller was right in asserting that the method needed for ethics is phenomenological method because it grabs the entire content of human experience, including ethical dimension, encounter with values, encounter with obligation, encounter with the feeling of guilt, all the ethical phenomena that sometimes would be put aside by other forms of introspection. One of the commentators writes, Scheller himself, against the psychologists of his day, asserted that the proper means for experimental research into ethically lived experience is not introspection and the psychiatrist analysis of unconscious, hereditary, environmental or other psychic drives and rationalization, but rather the phenomenological approach without presuppositions, which alone of the disciplines perhaps can take up the lived experience of the person in its wholeness and the wholeness of the person itself, the end of quotation. Wojtyła is aware, however, that the usefulness of the phenomenological method in ethics is limited. It can describe the person's experience of ethical values, but it cannot define the objective principle which decides why a human act is morally right or wrong. In order to define this principle, one has to place the ethical values, the experience of values, in the objective order of good. But that is possible only through metaphysical analysis, through realistic metaphysics. George Hanston Williams rightly points out, a Catholic ethicist may be phenomenological in his phenomenology, but not a phenomenologist. For a consistent or exclusive phenomenology would impose the postulate that ethical value reveals itself only in the lived experience of the person, where he, she acts in the moral realm. By a Catholic ethicist may be encouraged to go further with the method than Scheller himself, the end of quotation. After finishing his habilitation thesis, Karol Wojtyła has been employed at the Catholic University in Lublin, then proudly calling itself the only independent university behind the Iron Curtain, from Berlin to Vladivostok. During the next 4 years, starting in 1953, Wojtyła presented in Lublin 4 monographic courses called Lublin Lectures that we have in the second volume of the present English edition. Ethical act and ethical experience, good and value, the problem of norm and happiness, and the most famous, love and responsibility, in the last year before becoming a bishop, 1957-1958. What is most interesting, every one of these titles is built in the same way, where one word comes from the metaphysical tradition, ethical act, happiness, good, love, and the other from phenomenological one, ethical experience, value, responsibility, norm. So every title is this and this. Metaphysics, phenomenology in 4 different domains. In every one of the Lublin lectures, one finds an interesting relation between phenomenological insight and metaphysical explanation. Because my time is limited, let me point out only to one example, most crucial for really the ethical account of the human person. In his first monographic lecture, Act and Ethical Experience, Wojtyła returns to the most fundamental issue for ethics, which he had already which he had already touched in his polemics with Max Scheler. What is the essence of moral values? Wojtyła looks at the ethical systems of two fundamental for modernity philosophers, Immanuel Kant, whose work marks the peak of modernity, and Max Scheler, who, as I said, already announced the end of modernity and beginning of postmodernity. Wojtyła shows that neither of them explained how a person becomes morally good or bad through his or her acts. What is more, Wojtyła shows that the source of this lack consists of even more fundamental error than the inability to show what human freedom, which is the causality of the human subject, is about. Thus, the main problem is the lack of adequate understanding of human will in those philosophers. In Kant, in a way analogous to ancient Greek ethical intellectualism, the will seems to be only a part of deliberative reason, in the shadow of reason. In Scheler, who, in opposition to Kant, emphasizes the role of emotions in human life, will seems to be some form of emotional response to values. In order to find a more adequate description of free will and human freedom, Wojtyła turns to the metaphysical anthropology of Thomas Aquinas. In the Thomistic view of the will as rational desire, appetitus rationalis, which by nature turns to everything that reason recognizes as good, Wojtyła finds the key in explaining the ethical consequences of a person's causality. In human decisions, the will acts as a rational power, which on one hand has its own certain independence, constituting human freedom. The will turns to everything which is good on its own spontaneous dynamism. But on the other hand, the will, since it's a rational faculty, acts properly in accordance with its nature only when it cooperates with reason. That's the second motio quad specificationem in the human will. So in such description, will shows its true character as a rational power, distinct from reason, but rational. We read in the Lublin lectures, will, realizing its act in accordance with the intellectual reason of good, thus becomes good in the ethical sense. If, on the other hand, it carries out an act against the intellectual ratio of good, it becomes bad in the ethical sense. This becoming of the will is the very core of the human ethical acts. The content of the realization of this becoming is the ethical value itself, which is nothing more than a particular realization of this rationalitas naturae, of this rational character of the human person, through which an individual substantial being is a person. In such a case, it is not difficult to understand that the person becomes good or bad in the ethical sense by the act of will. The end of quotation. So the essence of becoming a morally good or bad person is what happens in the human will, seeking good, in its relation to reason, seeking truth. Ethical values concern then the ontological and not just the experiential dimension of human will. According to Wojtyła, the Aristotelian Thomistic theory of potentiality and actuality is the basic tool for explaining this ontological becoming of man, of the human subject, through the acts of the will, through the realization of the will. This is how he writes about it 15 years later in his book Persons and Act, his opus magnum. So far, we do not know the concept, and we do not know the language that would reflect the dynamic essence of change, any changes, taking place in any being apart from the one and only concept and the only one language that was given to us by the philosophy of potentia actus. On the basis of this concept and with the help of this language, all the dynamism taking place in any being can be adequately captured. It should also be used in the understanding of the dynamism inherent in man. Let me, in explaining this relation between phenomenology and metaphysics, let me get you now to the center of the quarrels about Wojtyła and the discussion whether he's metaphysician, whether he's phenomenologist, if he's phenomenologist, what kind phenomenologist is he? Certainly a heretical one, I think. And of course, this is the issue of consciousness, the main issue of modern anthropology. Before Wojtyła outlined for the first time his theory of human consciousness in the book Person and Act, he suggested in a number of articles that the traditional anthropology should be supplemented with the theory of consciousness. In his article, Thomistic Personalism from 1961, Wojtyła compares modern anthropology with the Thomistic concept of person. After Descartes, he writes, anthropology concentrated mostly on the analysis of consciousness, which was almost completely identified with the whole person. This led to a dualistic treatment of the human person. He writes, consciousness is an object of internal experience which consists in the introspection, while the body, similarly to everything else in nature, is an object of observation and external experience. This concept fails to incorporate the body into life and activity of the whole person. The end of quotation. It was late Professor William May here in the Institute in 1990s who during my studies here first pointed to me that the sources of criticism of Humane Vitae and a large part of Catholic bioethics lies in modern dualistic anthropology. We can only presume that these false anthropological dualistic presuppositions will only be strengthened today with the fascination on artificial intelligence and GPT, chat, and all this, intelligence without a body, right? Intelligence connected to a machine. Wojtyła begins his treatment on consciousness in Person and Act with a thesis that clearly separates him from most of the thinkers of the phenomenological tradition. He states that the fundamental function of consciousness does not consist in the intentional cognition, but in mirroring the objects that has already been cognized by the subject. In other words, consciousness is not an active power of cognizing the world. Let me elaborate. Consciousness, writes Wojtyła, is an understanding of what has already been understood. Right? Consciousness is secondary. consciousness has a passive character, while the human cognizing faculties must be active. They cannot be passive. They are engaged. According to the old Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, they are engaged actively in cognizing the world. That's our reason. That's our other cognizing faculties. Wojtyła's rejection, bold rejection, of the intentional character of consciousness has to be properly understood. Husserl defined intentionality as a unique peculiarity of experiences to be always the consciousness of something. In other words, everything that exists in our consciousness refers to an object, internal or external. Internal, for example, pain in our body. External, existence of the audience here, why I speak, dialogue with my own thoughts. Wojtyła does not deny, to be clear, that consciousness is always a consciousness of something. That's obvious. However, since he based his anthropological reflection on the Aristotelian notion of act, he defines the intentionality of human cognition in a way different from Edmund Husserl. For Wojtyła, intention and intentionality consist in active, directing upon the object. Therefore, only the real cognitive faculties of the person, knowledge and self-knowledge, possess intentional character. Consciousness only passively mirrors the outcome of the cognitive process of knowledge and self-knowledge. So consciousness is secondary. This epistemological position sets Wojtyła apart from the large part, majority of the phenomenological tradition. He writes, consciousness as such is restricted to mirroring what has already been cognized. Consciousness, so to speak, is the understanding of what has been already constituted and comprehended. The end of quotation. Well, if consciousness is portrayed here only as an accident of the human person, not even the cognizing faculty, so where are the primary cognitive faculties of the person? How do we cognize the world? According to Wojtyła, is the person itself, body and soul, that cognizes the world. At this point, Wojtyła proves himself to be part of Aristotelian Thomistic epistemological tradition, because for him, the human cognitive process starts with the body and its five senses. So, going back to the old Aristotelian saying, nihil in intellectu, nisi in sensu. Everything that appears in our knowledge, in our self-knowledge, and in our consciousness has to come from our bodily contact with the reality. Wojtyła proves himself here to be radically anti-Augustinian in sense of excluding any possibility of infused direct knowledge. It's the body that primarily cognizes, right? So theology of the body has a large support here in the philosophical understanding of the body. He writes in his Person and Act, man is a subject not only by his self-consciousness and by self-determination, but also based on his body. The structure of this body is such that it permits man to be the author of genuinely human activity. In this activity, the body expresses the person. As we know, in the theology of the body, John Paul II or Karol Wojtyła distinguished two primary meanings of the body, which go into the personal understanding of the body. The nuptial understanding of the body and parental understanding of the body, right? So a meaning which is, as Humane Vitae, as Paul VI prophetically pointed out in Humane Vitae, meaning which is grounded in the biological structure of our body, right? Biology is important, right? Biology is not animal. Biology of the human body is human, right? But let me point out that, in a sense, based on his book Person and Act, we can see a more fundamental meaning of the human body, which is personal. In other words, it is human body that allows us to be the human persons, that allows us to be the persons that we are. In other words, there is nothing of the personal character of being a person, volition, cognition, human relations, that does not start from the bodily dimension. So in a sense, I would hold, well, I don't think I'm very creative here, but I would hold that it's the body that creates this unique way of being the human person. In many our discussions, let me. I have one more point to make, but let me, before I do that, let me just point to one discussion that sometimes returns in our different encounters. In the famous article of Joseph Ratzinger, he criticizes Thomas Aquinas for lack of consistency in his use of the theological notion of the person, right? And this is going to be on the person. The future Pope stresses in the article that while talking about God, Aquinas used the theological notion of person as a relation. But when talking about human persons, he replaces the theological definition with the philosophical one, largely defective, coming from Boetius, individua substantia rationalis natura, with many holes and many inadequacies. What contribution may come to the argument of Joseph Ratzinger from Anthropology of Karol Wojtyła? Well, I think that main point comes in stressing the analogical understanding of the concept of person. Person as such is analogical concept. So if we talk in the world that we know about four kinds of persons, there are persons in God. Angels are persons. Humans are persons. And Jesus Christ is a person, very unique persons. And in every one of those four ontological levels, if we look closely, I don't know, perhaps somebody has already written a book on that, but if not, I wouldn't mind if somebody picks the subject. But if we would look up and the understanding of the person in every one of those four ontological levels. In God, the person is a relation, but not a substance, because there is one God and three persons. In angel, we have a person who is a spiritual substance, right? Every angel is separate, but no body, but cognition and volition. So the elements necessary for the personal dignity. Every one of us are humans, one rational nature, one substance, one person. which is created both materially and spiritually in the moment of conception, and Christ. Of course, what Joseph Ratzinger concentrates on, Christ, we have one substance, one human being, but with two natures, but only one person. But as opposite to what we would think, it's not a human person. It's the divine person that has been incarnated, right? As the Chalcedonian Creed tells us, there is only one person. There are no two persons in Christ. There is only one person, but it's the persons of the divine word, right? And of course, the anthropologists ask, where is the human person? There are no two persons. One person of the divine word. Anyway, the point basically is that in thinking about the human person, we have to use an analogical concept of the person. Person as typically human person with the body that has a personal meaning, the body that has personal meaning, that allows us to be the kind of persons we are, with ability to cognize, with ability to want things, with ability to know God, with ability to love, everything coming through the body. In the structure of this introductory lecture, I consciously had chosen a certain, as you see, a certain chronological path to show you a certain developments of Wojtyła's intuitions in terms of metaphysics and of phenomenology. Those intuitions and those lights that I just pointed out will be, of course, expanded by the speakers tomorrow. I cannot talk on any issue, but let me, in terms of the relationship between phenomenology and metaphysics, touch lastly on the last point, namely on the importance of metaphysics in Wojtyła's understanding of transcendence. Transcendence, which is his final word for explaining the human freedom. Wojtyła points out, and I do it just en passant, not trying to exhaust the subject, the issue here. Wojtyła points out that there are two levels of transcendence. There is horizontal transcendence, where we choose different objects or we cognize different objects, and there is vertical transcendence. What is vertical transcendence? The vertical transcendence is called by Wojtyła self-determination. So, by vertical transcendence is the human person, in a sense, who creates himself or herself. How does it happen? I think this is one of the most important elements of this ontology of the human subject. It happens through choices of different goods that are being done by the human will in cooperation with the human reason. But it's the reason that recognizes the nature of the human person, the proper goods of the human person, that is able to properly propose to the will either true or false goods that we either should choose or we should reject. So the choice in this so the horizontal choice of different goods really makes the person to create itself, to create himself or herself. I think it will be expanded tomorrow. My I guess my time is up and my energy is up. So I think I thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.